I've done a few videos on this handgun now. This is the Smith & Wesson SW9VE, which is the second generation of the Sigma pistols. This one had some improvements over the original one. You have a little bit of a rounded edge on the slide. You have a rail up here, even though it's proprietary. But for the most part, this has a lot of the same features that you had in the original SW9F. The inside components are pretty much the same. Smith & Wesson got sued by Glock over these. And I have done some upgrades on this. I put a Apex spring kit in it, which is the striker block spring that's in the slide and the trigger return spring. But the trigger pull on this is still a lot heavier than I'd like. So I also recently purchased the MCARBO spring, which actually goes in the sear. The sear on this has two coil springs, one inside the other one, which makes the trigger pull very, very hard. In this particular gun, because of the design of the trigger anyway, the trigger on this is very hard, and I've tried pulling it from the bottom at the very tip of this hinge, but I think the best place to pull it is right in the middle, right about where the pivot point is. And that's where you're going to get your best action out of this. But let's go ahead and figure out what the trigger pull is on this now, even with the Apex springs in it. And then I'll upgrade the MCARBO sear spring, and we'll see what the trigger pull is after that. Now again, keep in mind, this already has enhanced springs in it, which means that the trigger pull was even heavier before I put the Apex kit in it than it is now. But let's go ahead and check the current trigger pull on this. All right, so I don't know how well this is going to come across on camera, but I'm using the Wheeler trigger pull gauge, and I'm going to do 3 trigger pulls. Again, putting this guy right in the middle of that crook of the trigger. 8 pounds, 3.5 ounces on the first pull. £8, 1.8 ounce on the second pull. £8, 1.9 ounces on the third pull, for an average of 8 pounds, 2.4 ounces out of 3 pulls. So we're going to go ahead and install the MCARBO sear spring, which is this guy here. And after I do that, we're going to take another reading and see how much more this improves it over that 8 pounds, 2 ounces, or whatever it was. And again, you got to remember that the Apex spring kit that's in this did reduce the trigger pull significantly. I think this thing probably had about a 13-pound trigger before I put the Apex kit in it. So let's see how much more I can bring it down with that MCARBO spring. So to get an idea what both the Apex spring kit and the MCARBO spring kit replace, in the slide here, this is your striker block. Underneath this guy, there's a spring that's usually really stiff. So when the gun is cocked and you pull the trigger, this has to get pushed up to allow the firing pin to go forward or the striker to go forward. That's one spring that gets replaced with the Apex kit. The trigger assembly, there's a return spring right down here. Let me see if I can focus on it here. Right here, this trigger return spring, that also gets replaced with the Apex trigger spring kit. The MCARBO kit, it's a little difficult to see. Let me see if I can get some better light here. So the MCARBO spring kit replaces the sear spring, which is down inside the frame here. This little spring here. There's actually 2 springs in there, an inner spring and an outer spring. And the MCARBO spring kit replaces that spring there. If you want more information on that guy and you want more information on how to install it, I'm not going to do that here, but I just wanted to show what parts do get changed. And then this is the original spring that came out of this gun. It's very, very thick. It's a very heavy spring. You can see how heavy the gauge is, and I'll drop a picture in here with the difference between the new one and the old one. So let's try to do an average of 3 trigger pulls again. Remember before it was 8 pounds, 1.2 or 2.4 ounces. 6 pounds, 13 ounces on the first one. 6 pounds 9 ounces. 6 pounds 14 ounces for an average of 6 pounds 12 ounces. So it still went down about 1.5 pounds, which is substantial. And to be perfectly honest, it feels 100 times better. So even though the trigger pull only might have dropped about 1.5 pounds, it made a massive difference in the feel. And I can tell you now, this feels more like my SD9VE. In fact, let's pull the SD9VE out and see what that trigger pull is. All right, so we're going to do the same test on my SD9VE. This one just has an Apex spring kit in it, but I think the sear springs on these are a little bit better. Yeah, 4 pounds 15 ounces. Let's do a 3-round average with this guy. 4 pounds 14 ounces. 5 pounds 3.6 ounces. I'll do one more. 4 pounds 15 ounces for an average of just about 5 pounds on this guy. So the difference in the trigger pull between the SW9VE, which now has an Apex spring kit in it, which again is the trigger return spring, and the striker block spring, and an MCARBO sear spring in it, versus the SD9VE, which just has the trigger return spring and the striker block spring in it. This one is 5 pounds. This one is about 6 pounds 13 ounces, somewhere around there, but still way better than what it was. I bet I've cut the trigger pull in this in half. It was probably 13 or 14 pounds. Now it's under 7 pounds. It's usable now. It's way better than it was. It's still not quite as good as this one. You know what? While I'm at it, why don't I check out the SD9 2.0 as well? So I'm going to do the same trigger pull test with the SD9 2.0. Do a three pull average. 5 pounds 2.2 ounces. Pretty good. Which is weird because the first time I played with the trigger on this, I thought it felt much heavier than that. 4 pounds 15.5 ounces. And do one more. 5 pounds 4.6 ounces for an average of 5 pounds 2.1 ounces. So SD9 2.0 and the SD9VE have about the same trigger pull weight, and the SW9VE is a little bit heavier. So this one was around 5 pounds 2 ounces. This one was about the same, right around 5 pounds and a couple of ounces. This one is about 6 pounds, between 6 pounds 9 ounces and 6 pounds 11 ounces, but all three of these now have very good triggers. So just a fun little video, a little bit different than I normally do, but figured it would be worthwhile for somebody. If you have one of these old SW9VEs or an SW9F, I would recommend getting the Apex spring kit for this, which is about $24, and then also getting the sear spring for this, which after buying the spring and paying for shipping is probably around $20 as well. So for about 45 bucks and an hour and a half's worth of work, you can make your trigger pull cut in about half and make it a lot more smooth. Still a long, mushy trigger, a lot of take up, but way better than it was. Thanks again for watching another edition of Cranky Gun Reviews. God bless America. Support your 2A rights. Get out there and shoot. You remember, someone asked you to give up some of your freedom for the greater good. Remind them that freedom is the greater good.